Ma'am, this is my last warning. Step out of seat 2A and walk to the back of the plane before I have you escorted off. The voice cut through the cabin like a blade dragged across glass, sharp enough to silence the soft hum of conversation between the leather seats of North Star Atlantic's Flight 447. For a single, suspended second, no one breathed. Not the banker in seat 1C who had been thumbing through emails. Not the surgeon in 4D adjusting her cashmere wrap. Not the young father in 5B who had just lifted a coffee to his lips. And not Coraline Bishop. She sat by the window in seat 2A. A 72-year-old black woman with silver curls smoothed neatly against her temples, gold-rimmed reading glasses resting low on her nose, and a worn hardcover of poetry open in her lap. Her dress was the color of clay after rain, simple and pressed. Her shoes were flat and sensible, and on the lapel of her cardigan, a small pewter compass pin caught the gray light of a Boston morning, the needle frozen in time, pointing somewhere only she remembered. Standing over her, Brittany Vaughn wore the airline's slate blue uniform with the kind of precision that suggested control was a personal religion. Her ponytail was pulled so tight it lifted the corners of her eyes. Her name tag was straight. Her lipstick was perfect. And her smile had vanished sometime between the second glance and the third. "Ma'am," Brittany said again, the words stripped of any warmth, "I need to see your boarding pass." Coraline looked up slowly. Around them, the first-class cabin had gone so quiet you could hear the faint hiss of the ventilation overhead and, beyond the fuselage, the low rumble of the tug pushing back a neighboring aircraft. Outside the oval window, a fine drizzle painted the tarmac silver. Inside, 26 people watched a woman who had spent her life teaching others how to read the world be treated as if she had stumbled into a place she could not possibly afford. Coraline reached into her book and withdrew the boarding pass she had been using to mark her page. Her fingers did not tremble. Brittany did not so much take it as confiscate it. She did not glance at it the way a trained crew member confirms a name in a seat. She inspected it like contraband, turning it over, holding it up to the light, then looking back at Coraline's face as though the paper and the person could not possibly belong to one another. "Where did you get this?" Brittany asked. Coraline's eyes narrowed by a fraction so small most people would have missed it. "I bought it." From across the aisle, a low chuckle slid out of seat 2D. Gregory Hollister, 58, hedge fund partner, platinum frequent flyer, a man who believed his net worth had earned him the right to find other people inconvenient, lifted his mimosa and smiled without showing his teeth. He had noticed, of course. He had noticed Brittany greet every other passenger by name. He had noticed her skip row 2 during the welcome service. He had noticed, and he had approved. Brittany's mouth tightened. With what? The question hung there, polished and obscene. Coraline did not answer. She had heard that tone in department stores when clerks looked past her for a more important customer. She had heard it in bank lobbies when tellers asked twice for her identification. She had heard it from a young doctor once who had assumed she was the cleaning woman until her daughter walked in. She had carried 7 decades of these small, civilized cruelties wearing modest clothes and steady eyes. But this one had an audience. Near the forward galley, a younger flight attendant stood frozen with a tray of warm towels. Her name was Imani Carter. She was 31, 4 months into her first premium rotation, and black. Her jaw set. Her feet did not move. She knew the rule that no manual printed but every crew member learned. Speak up too loudly and you become the problem, the supervisor remembers. In seat 4D, the surgeon set down her phone. Her name was Dr. Helena Voss, and she had spent 2 decades reading bodies for signs of distress. She could see it now in the way Coraline's knuckles had gone pale around the spine of her book, and in the way Brittany's shoulders had squared into something a uniform should never carry. Brittany turned slightly toward the rest of the cabin, raising her voice just enough to perform. "Apologies, everyone. Sometimes passengers slip past the curtain when we're not looking." A man near the front looked down at his shoes. Someone behind row 3 coughed. A phone in row 5 lifted an inch, then hesitated. Coraline closed her book. The sound was small. "Final, my name," she said, her voice low and even, "is Coraline Bishop. My seat is 2A. My ticket is valid. I would like it returned to me, please." Brittany held her gaze a second too long. Then she smiled, not warmly, but in the way a hunter smiles when the trap has already closed. "We'll see about that." She turned and walked toward the galley with the boarding pass still in her hand. The cabin exhaled, but only halfway. The damage had already settled into the air, threading itself between the leather seats and the crystal flutes into every silent throat. Coraline turned her face toward the window. Her own reflection watched her back. Silver hair, tired eyes, a spine that had never learned to bend. She touched the small compass on her lapel. Her late husband had given it to her the year their son left for the Naval Academy on a scholarship that took everything they had to supplement. "Wear it," he had said, "so you always remember which way is true." What Brittany Vaughn did not know, as she carried that boarding pass toward the front of the aircraft, was that the woman she had just humiliated was not the small thing she had decided to see, and the last name printed on that wrinkled card was about to bring an entire airline to a halt. The boarding door was still open, but the cabin already felt sealed. Coraline Bishop could feel every eye in first class trying not to look at her, and that was the worst part, not the insult itself. Not even the way Brittany Vaughn had snatched her boarding pass like evidence in a trial no one had announced. It was the quiet afterward, the careful, well-mannered silence of people who wanted the comfort of premium service without the burden of conscience. She opened her book again, but the lines of poetry blurred into dark, meaningless shapes. Across the aisle, Gregory Hollister lifted his mimosa and watched her over the rim with the lazy amusement of a man who had never once in his life been asked to prove he belonged anywhere. His blazer was tailored. His watch flashed when he moved. Everything about him said the world was supposed to step aside, and on most days, it did. Brittany returned from the galley with a tablet pressed against her chest like a shield. Behind her, Imani Carter stood near the curtain, her face drawn tight. While Brittany had been pretending to investigate, Imani had quietly checked the passenger manifest herself. Seat 2A. Coraline Bishop. No conflict. No flag. No reassignment. No alert. Nothing. But Imani had also seen the look on Brittany's face when she walked away, and she knew the seat had never been the problem. Brittany stopped beside Coraline again. "Mrs. Bishop," she said, suddenly invoking the name now that she wanted authority to sound formal. "We're seeing a possible seating irregularity in our system." Coraline looked up. The book stayed open in her lap. "What kind of irregularity?" Brittany glanced around the cabin, calibrating her audience. "Your seat may have been assigned in error." "May have been," Coraline repeated softly. "Yes, ma'am. Then show me." Brittany blinked. "I beg your pardon." "Show me the error." A small ripple moved through the cabin. In seat 1A, a venture capitalist lowered his newspaper an inch. In 4D, Dr. Helena Voss tilted her head. That single request had shifted the geometry of the moment. Coraline had not raised her voice. She had not made a scene. She had simply asked for proof. Brittany's mouth thinned. "For privacy and security reasons, I'm not able to share passenger data." Coraline nodded the slow nod of a teacher hearing a story she has already heard 100 times. "Security reasons. That's correct. I taught literature for 38 years, Coraline said quietly. I know the sound of a student inventing an excuse after the homework has already gone undone. Someone coughed. Someone else suddenly found the carpet very interesting. Gregory Hollister leaned forward in 2D. "Ma'am, why don't you just make this easier on everyone?" Coraline turned her head toward him, not quickly, not angrily. Just enough. He held her gaze for half a second and then looked away to adjust the cuff of his blazer. Brittany seized the opening. "Sir, thank you. We're just trying to keep this flight on schedule." "No," Coraline said. "You are trying to move me." The words landed with such clean precision that Imani felt them in her own chest, 3 steps away. She wanted to step forward. She wanted to say what the tablet had shown her. She wanted to say that the only irregularity in this cabin was the woman in the uniform. But her supervisor's voice from last month was still warm in her memory. "You're new to premium, Imani. Don't make waves. Premium passengers want confidence, not conflict." So Imani held the tray tighter and stayed where she was and hated herself a little for it. Brittany's smile returned, thin as wire. "Mrs. Bishop, I'd like to offer you a complimentary seat in the main cabin so we can resolve this quietly. You'll still arrive in Seattle on time. I don't need another seat. I paid for this one." Brittany's eyes flicked to the pewter compass on Coraline's lapel, then to her plain leather handbag, then to her hands. Old hands. Hands that had graded essays at midnight by the light of a single lamp. hands that had braided granddaughter's hair and held the hands of dying friends and turned the pages of 10,000 books in classrooms with peeling paint and broken radiators. Brittany saw none of it. She saw only a woman she had already decided was small enough to push. "Ma'am," Brittany said, her voice sharpening into the shape of authority, "first class is reserved for confirmed premium passengers." Coraline lifted the boarding pass, now returned but creased at one corner from Brittany's grip. "Then I am exactly where I'm supposed to be." In seat 4D, Dr. Voss exhaled through her nose. She had spent her career listening for the moment a patient stopped pretending and started telling the truth. This was that moment, and it was not coming from the woman in the uniform. At the front of the cabin, the gate agent's voice drifted faintly from the jet bridge. Final boarding. Bags thudded into overhead bins. The aircraft hummed with the low, anxious rhythm of an imminent departure. Brittany leaned closer, lowering her voice until only Coraline could see how much fury sat behind the lipstick. "I am the lead flight attendant on this aircraft. If I determine there is a problem, there is a problem." Coraline did not move. "Then you have already decided." Brittany straightened, her cheeks burned. Her authority had been questioned calmly and publicly by the one passenger she had been certain would fold. That was when Gregory Hollister laughed under his breath. It was a small sound. It was enough. Brittany turned toward the cockpit door. "I'll speak to the captain." The cabin tightened around those 4 words. Imani felt her stomach drop. Dr. Voss folded her hands in her lap. Coraline looked back down at her book, but she no longer pretended to read. Outside the window, a baggage cart rolled past in the drizzle. Inside, something far heavier had already been loaded. Captain Marcus Reinhardt stepped into the cabin with the kind of measured stride that usually ended arguments before they fully began. He was 61, broad across the shoulders, gray at the temples, 4 gold stripes on each sleeve, and the slightly weary eyes of a man who had spent 4 decades believing experience was the same thing as wisdom. Passengers trusted uniforms. Passengers trusted captains. Passengers trusted the calm voice that came through the speaker during storms and rough air and unexpected holding patterns. Marcus Reinhardt knew that. He had worn authority for so long that it had begun somewhere along the way to feel like personality. Brittany Vaughn walked half a step behind him, her tablet clutched against her chest, her voice pitched just low enough to sound discreet and just loud enough to be heard. "She's been uncooperative from the start, Captain. I've tried to handle it respectfully, but she's making it difficult." Coraline Bishop heard every word. So did Imani Carter. So did Dr. Helena Voss. Gregory Hollister sat up straighter in 2D, pleased that a higher power had finally arrived to restore the order he believed in. He took another sip of his mimosa and crossed his ankles as though the curtain was about to rise on the second act. Reinhardt stopped at row 2. His eyes passed over Coraline quickly. Too quickly. Silver hair. Reading glasses, modest cardigan, small handbag, hardcover book, pewter pin. Black woman in a cabin full of polished, untroubled faces. He did not see a threat, but he saw a delay, and in commercial aviation, delay was a force with its own gravity. Schedules mattered. Gate slots mattered. Crew duty hours mattered. Complaints from premium passengers mattered. A calm woman in seat 2A had just become, in his mind, a problem to be solved before pushback. "Mrs. Bishop," he said. His voice was formal, controlled, and already finished with the conversation. "Yes, Captain. I understand there's a seat assignment issue." "There isn't." Brittany inhaled sharply. "Captain, I explained the system irregularity to you." Coraline did not look at her. She kept her eyes on Reinhardt. "She has not shown me any irregularity. She has inspected my boarding pass twice. She skipped my row during the welcome service. She told the cabin out loud that people sometimes wander past the curtain. Now she wants me removed." The words were clear and clean, and they did something to the room. A man in 3C shifted in his seat. Dr. Voss closed her eyes for half a breath. Reinhardt glanced at Brittany. Brittany's eyes widened just enough to look wounded. "Captain, that is not an accurate characterization of what happened." Coraline did not interrupt. She did not plead. She simply sat there, small in the wide leather seat, carrying the terrible weight of a woman forced once again to explain her own humanity to someone whose job description should have made the explanation unnecessary. Reinhardt lowered his voice. "Mrs. Bishop, my crew has the authority to manage this cabin, and I have a boarding pass for this seat." "No one is disputing that you have a boarding pass." "Then what are you disputing?" The question dropped into the cabin like a stone into still water. In seat 4D, Dr. Voss felt her hands curl into loose fists in her lap. She had heard people dodge truth by hiding behind procedure her entire career. It sounded exactly like this: calm words, official tone, no evidence, no accountability. Reinhardt glanced at the boarding pass in Coraline's hand but did not take it. To take it would have meant looking at it. To look at it would have meant verifying. To verify would have meant discovering that Brittany was wrong, and by that point he had already crossed the aisle to her side of the line. "Mrs. Bishop," he said, "for the comfort and timely departure of this flight, I'm asking you to accept the alternative seating my crew has arranged for you." Coraline's face changed only slightly. The softness around her eyes thinned. "The comfort of whom, Captain?" Gregory Hollister muttered, "Oh, for God's sake." Coraline turned to him with the patience of a woman who had outlasted louder men. "Mr. Hollister, I have taught teenagers more patient than you." A small choked sound came from somewhere near row 4. Imani pressed her lips together hard. Brittany's cheeks went scarlet. "This is exactly the attitude I was telling you about, Captain." "No." The word came from row 4. Everyone turned. Dr. Helena Voss had risen halfway out of her seat. Her wrap had slipped from her shoulders. Her voice was steady in the way a surgeon's voice is steady when she has already seen the bleed and is calculating the time it will take to stop it. "That woman has been calm from the first second of this. Your flight attendant has not, and I would like the record to reflect that I am saying so." Brittany turned on her. "Ma'am, please stay out of crew matters." Dr. Voss did not blink. "I have been watching this exchange for 15 minutes. I am a witness, whether you would like one or not." For the first time since he had stepped through the curtain, Captain Reinhardt hesitated. Imani Carter stopped breathing for a count of 3. There it was. Someone had said it out loud. Someone with no uniform, no clipboard, no career inside this airline to lose. But authority does not always collapse when challenged. Sometimes it hardens. Reinhardt straightened. "Ladies and gentlemen, we need to prepare for departure. This matter will be resolved now." He turned back to Coraline. "Mrs. Bishop, I'm going to ask you one final time to gather your belongings and accept the reassignment my crew has arranged. If you refuse, we will have to remove you from the aircraft." The cabin emptied of sound. Even Gregory's mimosa paused in midair. Coraline looked at him for a long, quiet moment. Then she looked down at the pewter compass on her lapel. Her thumb brushed the small needle. She thought of her late husband, of long bus rides to schools that had no chalk, of a son who had once stood on a tarmac in his ensign's whites and saluted her in the rain. Then she stood, slowly, not in defeat but in documentation. Every phone in the cabin lifted at once. Brittany stepped back, startled by the dignity of it. Reinhardt moved aside. Gregory found something fascinating in the window. Coraline gathered her book in her handbag, and as she passed Imani, their eyes met. Imani's face cracked open with shame. "I'm sorry," Imani whispered. Coraline paused just long enough to answer. "Then remember this feeling." She walked through the curtain. The text message left Coraline Bishop's phone at 7:18 in the morning. 3 words. It happened again. No subject line. No explanation. No exclamation point. Just a sentence heavy enough to cross the eastern seaboard faster than any aircraft. At North Star Atlantic's headquarters in Arlington, Virginia, 22 floors above the Potomac, Julian Bishop was standing in a glass-walled boardroom with 7 senior executives, reviewing the third-quarter operations dashboard through the windows behind him. The morning sun was beginning to burn off the river fog. Coffee steamed in white ceramic cups. A presentation glowed against the far wall, numbers shifted across the screen, the kind of numbers that justified bonuses and quieted boards. On the long mahogany table sat binders thick with customer satisfaction metrics, on-time performance graphs, and complaint summaries his team had reduced into clean color-coded charts because charts were easier to look at than people. Julian was 48, tall, lean, with his mother's careful eyes and his father's quiet shoulders. He wore a dark navy suit, no flashy watch, no loud tie. His authority did not need decoration. It lived in the way he listened, in the precise stillness of his hands when other people were waving theirs around. His phone buzzed once against the polished wood. He glanced down. The room kept talking for a heartbeat before everyone noticed he had stopped reading. Julian read the message twice. Something in his face went cold. Not angry yet. Colder than angry. Adrienne Park, his chief operating officer, saw it first. She had known Julian for 9 years and had watched him handle a ground stop in a blizzard, a wildcat strike in Phoenix, a near-miss incident report that had cost 2 careers and saved hundreds of lives. Julian did not rattle, he did not raise his voice, he did not waste motion, but now his thumb was pressed so hard against the edge of the phone that the skin around the nail had gone white. "Julian?" Adrienne asked. He lifted his eyes from the screen. "My mother is on flight 447. The General Counsel, David Yamamoto, looked up sharply. "The Boston to Seattle out of Logan." "Yes." A young vice president at the far end of the table cleared her throat. "Is there a medical issue?" Julian did not answer right away. He looked at the dashboard still glowing on the wall. Premium customer satisfaction trending upward. Complaint volume trending downward. Trending, not vanishing. He turned to Adrienne. "Hold that aircraft." The room went silent. Adrienne stood. "I'll call dispatch now." She was already moving toward the door before she reached the second syllable. Julian turned to David. "Pull the passenger record for Coraline Bishop, seat 2A. I want the manifest, the crew roster, the service notes, the gate scan, and any seat reassignment activity within the last 90 minutes." David's tablet was already in motion. He had seen discrimination complaints before. Usually they arrived after the video had already begun spreading, after a hashtag had already trended, after a leadership team had asked, in the polite voice of the doomed, how no one had seen it coming. This time the warning had come from the CEO's mother. But the look on Julian's face said this was not personal alone. This was structural. At Gate 14B in Boston, the jet bridge still clung to Flight 447 when the operations call came through. Inside the cockpit, Captain Marcus Reinhardt heard the radio crackle. "North Star 447, hold position. Do not close the boarding door. Repeat, do not close the boarding door." Reinhardt frowned. "Reason?" "Corporate operations hold." Brittany Vaughn was standing in the forward galley when she heard it. Her shoulders tightened, just slightly. The way a person's shoulders tighten when an answer they have not yet been asked to give is suddenly being prepared in another room. She looked toward the cockpit, then back toward first class, where seat 2A sat empty except for the faint warmth Coraline had left in the leather. Gregory Hollister leaned into the aisle. "Are we delayed now?" Brittany forced a smile. "Just a small operational matter, Mr. Hollister." But her voice had lost its polish. Imani Carter heard it too. She was standing near the curtain, still holding the towel tray she had never offered to Coraline. Her stomach turned as she looked at the empty seat, and then toward the closed curtain that separated first class from the rest of the aircraft. She knew the hold was connected. She did not yet know how. In row 26, Coraline sat between a young woman with dyed lavender hair and an older man in a Red Sox cap. Her knees throbbed from the long walk. Her cheeks felt warm with the humiliation no one had touched. She placed her phone face down on her lap. The young woman beside her, who could not have been more than 22, leaned over slightly. "Ma'am, are you okay?" Coraline smiled without showing her teeth. "I have been better, sweetheart." The honesty caught the girl off guard. She glanced toward the front of the plane, then back at Coraline. That wasn't right, what they did. "No," Coraline said quietly. "It wasn't." Back at headquarters, David's tablet chimed. He looked at the data and went still. Julian saw the answer before David spoke. "There was no seat irregularity," David said. "No duplicate booking, no system flag, no reassignment request until after the passenger was already moved." Adrienne stepped back into the room, phone pressed to her ear. "Aircraft is held, boarding door open, crew is asking why." Julian picked up his briefcase. "Tell them I'm coming." Adrienne lowered the phone. "To the aircraft." "To the aircraft." She did not argue. She nodded once and lifted the phone back to her ear. Julian stopped at the door and turned back to the room. His voice was low, almost gentle and sharp enough to cut paper. "For years our customers have been telling us who we become when no one important is watching. This morning, someone important was watching. She happened to be sitting in the seat my crew decided she did not deserve." No one spoke. Julian walked out. By the time his car pulled away from the curb on Crystal Drive, the audit was already building itself, line by line, in a server farm 3 states away. Julian Bishop's black sedan moved through the early Arlington traffic like a warning no one could yet hear. In the back seat, he did not speak. Adrienne Park sat beside him with her tablet open, one hand pressed flat against the screen as though she could hold the data still by force. Names, times, seat scans, crew identifiers, service notes, every line built the shape of what had happened on Flight 447. Brittany Vaughn, Adrienne said quietly. Senior flight attendant. 11 years with North Star. 2 prior passenger complaints, both closed without formal discipline. Julian kept his eyes on the road ahead. Read them. Adrienne's voice flattened into the careful tone she used when reading a deposition aloud. First complaint, 2021. A Latina passenger on a Newark to Miami flight. She alleged Ms. Vaughn questioned her presence in business class twice and asked to see her boarding pass 3 times. Closed as a miscommunication. Second complaint, 2023. An Indian-American family on a return from London. They alleged Ms. Vaughn skipped their row during meal service and instructed them to lower their voices when they had not been speaking loudly. Closed with verbal coaching. The word coaching sat in the car like rotting fruit. Julian turned his head slowly. Who closed them? Adrienne already had the answer ready. Regional in-flight management, the same chain that approved her premium service rotation this morning. Julian's jaw tightened once. That was all. But Adrienne, who had spent the last decade learning to read his small movements, recognized the meaning of that single muscle. The problem had roots. It was no longer one flight attendant with a sharp mouth. It was every supervisor who had quietly softened the word discrimination into miscommunication because the truth would have required harder paperwork. The driver slid onto the 14th Street Bridge and the city of Washington rose on the left, white and unbothered. And Julian thought of his mother sitting in row 26 with her book closed and her hands folded and her dignity carried like something she had to hold above floodwater. At gate 14B, the passengers were beginning to shift. Flight 447 had not moved. The boarding door remained open. The jet bridge still clung to the aircraft like a second skin. Outside, the ground crew paused near the nose wheel, looking up at the still parked jet with the puzzled expressions of people who had finished their part of the job and could not understand why nothing was happening. Inside, the air changed minute by minute. First curiosity, then irritation, then suspicion. Gregory Hollister pressed his call button. Brittany appeared almost immediately, desperate for something familiar to manage. Yes, Mr. Hollister. He tapped the face of his watch. I have a meeting at the Columbia Tower at 1 o'clock Pacific. Why are we still sitting at this gate? Brittany gave him her rehearsed smile. We're waiting on clearance from operations. Operations, Gregory repeated. He nodded toward the curtain. Because of her. Brittany's smile froze on her face like a photograph that had been left in the sun too long. I'm not permitted to discuss passenger matters. But her eyes betrayed her, and Gregory saw it, and for the first time that morning, his amusement curdled into something less comfortable. Unbelievable. Across the aisle, Dr. Helena Voss watched Brittany's hands. They were too still. People with nothing to hide were rarely that careful with their fingers. You seem nervous, Ms. Vaughn, Helena said evenly. Brittany turned. Pardon me? I said you seem nervous. Brittany's lips parted, then closed. Ma'am, we are managing a routine operational delay. No, Helena said. You are waiting for consequences. The word landed harder than a shout. Imani Carter looked down at the empty towel tray in her hands. She felt the back of her neck go hot. She had watched Coraline Bishop walk away with a straight back, while everyone else sat inside their comfort, and she had done nothing, and that nothing was beginning to feel heavier than her uniform. In row 26, Coraline did not ask why the plane was held. She already knew. The older man beside her, the one in the Red Sox cap, cleared his throat. He was somewhere in his late 60s, weathered around the eyes, wearing a denim jacket over a flannel shirt. Ma'am, he said low. I should have said something back there. Coraline turned her head slightly. I saw what happened. I kept thinking somebody else was going to speak up. He looked down at his hands. I'm sorry I wasn't that somebody. Coraline looked at him for a long moment. That is how most wrong things keep happening. He nodded slowly, as though her sentence had pressed itself flat against his sternum. The young woman with the lavender hair pulled out one earbud. Are you going to sue them? Coraline smiled faintly. Young lady, I have not even had my breakfast. The girl almost laughed, but the laugh died in her throat when she saw Coraline's eyes, because she was not joking. She was tired. Not weak. Tired. tired in the old marrow-deep way of a woman who had carried the same insult through different decades wearing different clothes, who had been asked to prove the obvious in too many lobbies and waiting rooms and parent-teacher conferences, who had survived by knowing exactly when to speak and when to outlast. At the gate, Coraline Bishop stepped out of the sedan. Adrienne followed with 2 corporate security officers in plain dark suits. David Yamamoto from legal had arrived in a separate vehicle and was already holding a slim leather folder against his chest. Julian did not rush. He did not need to. His pace was steady, contained, almost quiet. But the gate agents and the ramp supervisors and the airline employees moving through the concourse stepped out of his path before they understood why. The gate agent at 14B saw him first. Her face shifted from confusion to recognition to something close to fear. "Mr. Bishop," Julian held out his hand. "Do not announce me." "Yes, sir." "Is the boarding door open?" "Yes, sir." "Good." He looked through the glass of the gate window at the jet bridge. Beyond it, Flight 447 waited in the gray morning light like a sealed envelope. David stepped close. "Sir, you should see one more thing before you go in." Julian did not look away from the aircraft. "Tell me." David opened the folder. "After your mother was moved, a seat reassignment entry was created manually in the system." Adrian's eyes snapped up. Julian turned slowly. "By whom?" David glanced at the page. "Brittany Vaughn's crew login." For 1 second, even the airport seemed to quiet around them. Julian's voice dropped to something lower than the engines outside. "She moved my mother first, then she created the record to justify it." David nodded once. "That is what the timestamps show." "No," Julian said. "That is what it is." He turned and walked into the jet bridge. Inside the aircraft, Captain Marcus Reinhardt stood near the cockpit door listening to operations through his headset, his face arranged into the careful neutrality of a man who had begun to suspect in the last 20 minutes that something larger than a seating dispute was moving toward him. Brittany Vaughn hovered beside him, paler beneath her makeup than she had been at boarding. Imani Carter stood behind them both, her eyes fixed on the open door. Then Coraline Bishop stepped onto the plane. No announcement, no raised voice, no theatrical pause. Just a man in a navy suit with the quiet of authority arranged around him like a second jacket. Brittany blinked, confused for half a second. Then recognition arrived, and the color went out of her face all at once. She did not need to have met him. His photograph hung in every North Star crew room in the country, above the framed letter he had written the day he took the job, the letter that began, "We owe every passenger more than transportation. We owe them respect." She had read that letter dozens of times. She had walked past it that morning before she clocked in. Captain Reinhardt straightened. "Mr. Bishop." Julian looked at him, then at Brittany, then at the empty seat 2A. His eyes stopped there. The cabin felt the temperature drop. "Where," Julian said, each word level and clean, "is Coraline Bishop?" Brittany's mouth opened, but no sound came out. That silence told Julian more than any explanation could have. Adrienne stepped onto the aircraft behind him, followed by David Yamamoto and the 2 security officers. No one spoke. They did not have to. Their presence alone turned the aisle into a tribunal. Julian's eyes returned to Brittany. "Where is she?" Brittany swallowed. Her hand tightened around her tablet. She was reaccommodated. The word was polished. Corporate. Empty. Julian took 1 step closer. "Where is she?" Her voice cracked at the edge. "Main cabin. Row 26. The cabin went still. Gregory Hollister's mimosa lowered an inch. Dr. Helena Voss closed her eyes briefly, as though the truth had finally walked into the room wearing a suit and tie. Julian turned toward the curtain that separated first class from the rest of the aircraft. Then he stopped. He looked back at Captain Reinhardt. "Did you verify the alleged seat issue before removing her?" Reinhardt drew a breath. "I trusted my senior crew member." "That was not my question." A few passengers shifted. Reinhardt's face hardened, more from embarrassment than from courage. Julian's voice stayed low. "Did you personally verify the seat issue?" "No." "Did you ask Mrs. Bishop for her account?" Reinhardt hesitated. "No." "Did you review the manifest?" "No." "Did you check the gate scan?" "No." "Then you did not make a command decision, Captain. You endorsed someone else's bias and gave it the weight of 4 gold stripes." The words landed with the force of a verdict. Brittany's face flushed. "Sir, that's not fair. She was being difficult. She refused to cooperate." "I was trying to protect the integrity of the premium cabin." Julian turned to her. "Protect it from whom?" Brittany froze. There it was. The question beneath every other question she had asked that morning. The question she had dressed in policy, hidden behind procedure, softened with the phrase passenger comfort. Protected from whom? Gregory Hollister looked down at his lap. Imani's hands trembled. The empty towel tray rattled softly against her knee. Julian stepped into the aisle and began walking toward the curtain. He did not look back to see whether Adrienne and David were following him. He knew they were. The passengers in the main cabin looked up as he passed. Some recognized him. Most did not. They saw a tall black man in a navy suit moving through their economy aisle with the steady, unhurried gravity of a man on his way to something he had been waiting his whole career to address, and they instinctively pulled their elbows in and their bags out of the aisle. At row 26, Coraline Bishop sat between the young woman with lavender hair and the older man in the Red Sox cap. Her book was closed in her lap. Her phone was face down on her thigh. Her shoulders were straight, but Julian saw what no one else in the cabin had been positioned to see. The tiredness around her eyes, the humiliation she had refused to let spill, the ache of being asked once more to carry grace for people who had given her none. "Mom?" Julian said. The word moved through the cabin faster than any announcement could have. The young woman's eyes went round. The man in the Red Sox cap sat back hard against his seat as though he had been pushed. Coraline looked up. For the first time that morning, her face softened. Julian. He crouched beside her seat so that he would not tower over her. The chief executive officer of North Star Atlantic Airlines, kneeling in the aisle of his own aircraft, looking at his mother the way a son looks at his mother before anything else. "Are you all right?" Coraline studied his face. "I am not injured." "That was not what I asked." Her eyes glistened then, not with weakness but with the weight of a woman who had been holding herself together for nearly an hour and was finally being allowed to set the weight down. "No," she said quietly. "I am not all right." Julian nodded once. Behind him, Adrienne looked away. David lowered his folder. The man in the Red Sox cap wiped his cheek with the back of his hand. "Sir," he said, "I saw what happened up there. I should have said something. I didn't." Julian looked at him. Not cruel. Not gentle either. "Then remember what silence costs?" The man nodded, taken apart by the simplicity of it. Julian stood and offered Coraline his hand. "Come on, Mom." She placed her hand in his. Slowly, carefully, she rose from row 26. The young woman with lavender hair stood too, stepping into the aisle to give Coraline room. As Coraline walked forward, the entire aircraft watched. This time no one whispered. This time no one smirked. This time every step said what Brittany had spent the morning trying to erase. Coraline Bishop had not been moved because of a system error. She had been moved because someone had looked at her and decided she did not belong. When they reached first class, Brittany stood pale near the galley. Captain Reinhardt's jaw was tight. Gregory Hollister was studying the carpet. Julian guided his mother back to seat 2A. Coraline sat down slowly. She placed her book on the side table. She touched the small pewter compass on her lapel. Julian turned to the cabin. "My name is Julian Bishop," he said. "I am the Chief Executive Officer of North Star Atlantic Airlines." A sharp breath went through the room. He looked at Brittany. "And this is Coraline Bishop, my mother." No one moved. No one dared. Julian's voice dropped lower. "Now we are going to talk about what happened in my first-class cabin." Brittany Vaughn stood in the aisle like a woman trapped inside her own uniform. For 11 years, that uniform had protected her. It had turned her opinions into instructions. It had made passengers lower their voices, gather their belongings, apologize for things they had not done. She had worn authority for so long that she had forgotten it was borrowed, and now Julian Bishop was looking at her in a way that made her remember. "Ms. Vaughn," he said, "explain the seat irregularity." Brittany blinked. "Sir." "The one you used to remove my mother from seat 2A. She glanced at Captain Reinhardt. Julian's voice cut across the glance. "Do not look at him. Look at me." A phone shutter clicked softly somewhere in row 3. Brittany swallowed. The system showed a possible conflict. David Yamamoto opened the folder in his hand. No, it did not. Brittany's eyes snapped toward him. David's voice was calm, almost surgical. There was no duplicate booking, no passenger conflict, no automatic seat flag, no security notation, no gate alert, no premium cabin exception. The manifest was clean from the moment Mrs. Bishop scanned her boarding pass at the jet bridge. Adrienne held up her tablet, screen glowing. The only seat adjustment connected to Mrs. Bishop was entered manually after she had already been moved. A slow physical discomfort moved through the cabin. Passengers shifted in their seats as the lie began losing its bones. Julian did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Who entered it? Adrienne looked at Brittany. The crew login assigned to Brittany Vaughn. Brittany's lips parted. I was documenting the change after the fact. After what fact? Julian asked. She stiffened. After she refused to cooperate. Coraline sat in 2A, her hands folded over her book, her face composed. But her eyes stayed on Brittany, not with hatred, with memory. That was worse. Brittany turned slightly toward the cabin, searching for the support she had enjoyed when she had been the one in control of the room. Gregory Hollister looked away. The man who had smirked when Coraline was humiliated was now studying the stitching of his leather seat as though it contained scripture. His face had gone pale around the mouth. He understood power. He respected it. He had simply misread where it lived. Julian saw him. Mr. Hollister. Gregory froze. You spoke to my mother during the incident. Gregory cleared his throat. I may have said something about keeping the flight on schedule. That is not what I asked. Gregory's fingers tightened around the stem of his empty mimosa flute. I told her to move. Why? The question was simple. Gregory had no decent answer. He glanced at Coraline, then down. I did not know who she was. The cabin absorbed that sentence like a confession. Julian took one step toward him. That is the problem. You should not have needed to know. Gregory's face caved inward. No lawsuit, no editorial in the Wall Street Journal, no corporate sensitivity training could have struck him as cleanly as that. He had just revealed, in front of 24 strangers, the private operating system of his conscience. Respect, conditional, dignity, status dependent. Dr. Helena Voss rose slowly from seat 4D. Her voice carried the weight of a clinician about to deliver a diagnosis no one in the room wanted. Mr. Bishop, I witnessed the exchange from the beginning. Your mother remained calm throughout. Ms. Vaughn questioned her repeatedly, ignored her during the welcome service, and implied to the cabin out loud that your mother had slipped past the curtain. Brittany snapped. That is a mischaracterization. Helena turned on her with the steady precision of someone who had spent 30 years telling people their bodies were failing them. It is an accurate characterization, and I regret only that I did not say it the first time you opened your mouth. The words moved through the cabin differently than any of the others. They were not accusation. They were repentance. Imani Carter stood near the galley, breathing too fast. Her empty tray was gone now, set down on the counter behind her. Her hands were empty, which somehow made her feel more exposed. Julian looked at her. Ms. Carter. Imani flinched. He knew her name. Of course he did. By now he knew every name on the roster. Yes, sir. What did you see? Brittany's eyes hardened, a silent warning. Imani felt it land between her shoulder blades, the way she had felt it from supervisors and co-workers and passengers who believed a black flight attendant should be grateful just to be there. She had built her short career on staying careful, smiling through comments, laughing when nothing was funny, disappearing when authority turned cruel. But Coraline Bishop was sitting in 2A again, and the shame in Imani's chest had become too large to swallow. She stepped forward. I saw Ms. Vaughn skip Mrs. Bishop during the welcome service, Imani said. Her voice shook on the first sentence, then steadied. I saw her inspect Mrs. Bishop's boarding pass when she had not asked any other passenger to produce theirs. I checked the manifest on my tablet while Ms. Vaughn was in the galley. There was no irregularity. Mrs. Bishop was in her assigned seat. Brittany whispered, Imani. Imani did not look at her. I should have spoken up. I didn't. I was afraid. For the first time, Coraline's expression changed. Not into forgiveness. Not yet. Into recognition. The recognition of a woman who had once been a young black professional in a room that did not want her there, and who knew, deeply, what Imani had just spent to say what she had said. Julian let the silence sit. He wanted everyone to feel it. Fear, bias, cowardice, convenience. The entire quiet machinery of injustice running smoothly until one passenger with the wrong last name happened to get caught in it. Captain Reinhardt shifted his weight. Mr. Bishop, with respect, I acted on the information I was given. Julian turned slowly, With respect, Captain. You acted without information. Reinhardt's face darkened. You did not investigate, Julian continued. You did not ask the passenger. You did not check the manifest. You did not review the gate scan. You accepted a false narrative because it was faster than the truth. Your aircraft is not your kingdom. Your command authority exists to protect safety, not prejudice. That sentence ended whatever defense Reinhardt had been preparing. Adrienne stepped forward, her voice clipped and formal. Ms. Vaughn, effective immediately, you are removed from duty pending investigation. Please surrender your crew badge and your company device. Brittany stared at her, then at Julian, then at Coraline. For a moment, all the cruelty drained out of her face and left only fear. This is my career, she said. Coraline answered before Julian could. No, she said quietly. This is your consequence. Brittany's hand trembled as she unclipped her badge. The small plastic card made a dull sound when it landed in Adrienne's palm. No one clapped. No one cheered. The cabin was too ashamed for that. Julian looked around at the passengers, his voice low but carrying to every row. What happened here was not a misunderstanding. It was a choice, and every person who saw it and stayed silent became part of it. Coraline looked out the window. The pewter compass on her lapel caught the morning light again. Outside, the aircraft still had not moved. Inside, for the first time all morning, something had. Brittany Vaughn walked off the aircraft without looking back. The two corporate security officers followed behind her, close enough to make the message clear, far enough to leave her alone with every step. Her shoes struck the jet bridge floor in sharp, hollow taps that faded as she reached the terminal. For 11 years she had moved through aircraft aisles like she owned them. Now she left one as a stranger. Inside the cabin, no one seemed to know where to put their eyes. Captain Marcus Reinhardt stood near the cockpit door with his face arranged into the rigid composure of a man whose pride had been disassembled in front of strangers, crew, and the executive who signed the highest orders in the company. He wanted to defend himself again. He wanted to say that the situation had escalated. He wanted to say that he had been protecting the schedule. But every excuse sounded smaller before it reached his mouth, and he had enough years left in his career to recognize the difference between an explanation and a justification. Julian Bishop stood in the aisle beside seat 2A. His mother sat quietly by the window, the book back in her lap, though she had not opened it. The pewter compass on her lapel caught the cabin light, and it looked almost alive now, a small needle holding steady inside a small circle of metal. Julian turned to Captain Reinhardt. You will not operate this flight today. The captain's eyes widened. Mr. Bishop, this aircraft will depart with a replacement captain. Reinhardt straightened. With respect, sir, removing a captain minutes before departure is an operational disruption. Julian's gaze did not move. So was removing a paying passenger from her seat because your crew member was uncomfortable with her presence. The cabin went silent again, but it was a different silence than before. It no longer sheltered the powerful. It exposed them. Reinhardt's jaw worked once. I have operated this aircraft safely for 34 years. And this morning, Julian said, you failed before it ever left the ground. The words were not shouted. That made them worse. Adrienne stepped forward, her tablet in hand. Captain Reinhardt, Operations has assigned Captain Renata Aguilar as the replacement. She is in the terminal and will board within 10 minutes. You are to report to corporate review after leaving the aircraft. Reinhardt looked toward the cockpit, then back at the passengers. For the first time, he seemed to understand that authority could be removed as quickly as it was granted. He nodded once, stiffly. Understood. As he turned to leave, he passed Imani Carter near the galley. She stepped back, not out of fear this time, but because she needed space from what his silence had helped to build. Reinhardt paused near Coraline's row. He looked at her. Mrs. Bishop, he said, his voice strained. I regret how this was handled. Coraline looked up at him. For a moment, the cabin waited for forgiveness, because people often expect the wounded to make everyone comfortable again. Coraline did not. You regret the handling, she said quietly. I regret the harm. Reinhardt swallowed. There was nothing left to say. He left the aircraft. A minute later, the plane felt strangely leaderless. No senior attendant, no captain, no polite illusion that anything was as it had been. The passengers sat in expensive seats, surrounded by warm lighting and folded napkins, and yet the cabin felt stripped down to something raw and plain. Dr. Helena Voss rose from 4D and moved into the aisle. I owe you an apology, Mrs. Bishop, she said. Coraline turned slightly. You spoke up. Too late. Coraline studied her face. The surgeon's eyes were wet, though her posture remained composed. A woman accustomed to weighing the failings of others' bodies was now learning to weigh her own. I knew it was wrong from the first question, Helena continued. I heard the tone before the words finished. I waited until the damage had already been done. Why? Coraline asked. Helena breathed in. Because I told myself someone else would, because I did not want to be part of a scene. Because I have spent 30 years inside operating rooms where seniority decides whose voice carries, and somewhere along the way, I stopped speaking outside of them. Her voice broke on the last word. That is not an excuse. No, Coraline said gently. It is not. Helena nodded. She accepted the sentence like a ruling, and somehow she stood a little straighter after she had received it. Imani stepped forward next, slower than Helena, her face open with a younger kind of shame. Mrs. Bishop, she said, I am sorry. Coraline looked at her for a long moment. Imani's eyes shone. I checked the tablet. I knew your seat was correct. I knew Ms. Vaughn was lying. I kept telling myself I was new to premium. I kept telling myself I could not afford to make waves. Her voice dropped. But you were sitting there alone, and I was standing 3 feet away with the truth in my hand. Coraline's expression softened, not enough to erase the hurt, but enough to let the truth enter the room without punishment. Fear is real, child, Coraline said. So is responsibility. Imani nodded, crying now, quietly, without performance. Julian watched his mother. He had seen her hold this exact posture in her classroom more years ago than he could count, never humiliating a student, never excusing them either. She believed accountability was a form of hope. If a person could name the wrong, they still had a chance to become better than it. Gregory Hollister stood suddenly from 2D. His movements were awkward, stripped of his earlier ease. Mrs. Bishop, he said. Coraline did not answer. I was wrong. I treated this like an inconvenience. I treated you like the delay. I did not see what was actually happening. Julian turned to him. You saw enough. Gregory flinched. Coraline looked at Julian, then back at Gregory. Yes, she said. He did. Gregory lowered his head. Outside the window, the replacement captain crossed the tarmac toward the jet bridge, her uniform dark against the morning light, her stride measured. Inside the cabin, something quieter than justice had begun. Not comfort, not closure, recognition. And for some of the people on Flight 447, recognition hurt more than punishment ever could have. Captain Renata Aguilar boarded Flight 447 with no announcement and no wasted motion. She was 55, compact, sharp-eyed, and steady in the way that experienced pilots become steady when they have spent decades absorbing other people's emergencies. Her dark hair was pinned into a low knot. Her uniform was freshly pressed. Her expression carried the calm of someone who had walked into difficult cabins before and understood, deep in her bones, that dignity mattered most in a room that had just lost it. Julian Bishop met her near the forward galley. Captain Aguilar. Mr. Bishop. She glanced once at Coraline in 2A, then at the quiet passengers, then back at Julian. She understood more than she asked. Good leaders often did. I have the aircraft. Julian nodded once. Thank you. She turned toward the cabin. Her voice was clear, grounded, and human. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Captain Renata Aguilar. I will be operating your flight to Seattle this morning. We understand there has been a serious delay and a serious failure of conduct in this cabin. Safety remains our first priority, but respect is not separate from safety. It is part of it. We will complete our final checks and depart as soon as we are cleared. No one complained. Not Gregory Hollister. Not the passengers in the main cabin who had been checking their watches 20 minutes earlier. Not the people who had looked away when Coraline was first walked down the aisle. Something had shifted. The flight was still late, but time had stopped feeling like the greatest loss in the room. Julian leaned down beside his mother. I can take you off this flight. We can arrange another aircraft, a private charter. Anything. Coraline looked at him with the patient half-smile she had used to wear when wiping peanut butter from his face before kindergarten. No. Julian's face tightened. Mom, I paid for this seat. I know. And I'm going to sit in it. He looked at her for a long moment. He understood it was not stubbornness, it was restoration. She had been publicly removed, so she would publicly remain, not for pride, but for the quiet correction of the record. Julian nodded slowly. Then I will stay until the door closes. Coraline touched his hand. You have a company to run. His voice softened. This is me running it. Across the aisle, Imani Carter had changed into the posture of someone who had made a decision she could not take back. She approached Julian, her company tablet held in both hands. Mr. Bishop, Julian turned. I would like to submit a written statement before we depart, a full one, not just what I saw, what I failed to do. Adrian Park looked up from her own tablet. Julian studied Imani for a moment. Why now? Imani swallowed. Because I told myself staying quiet would protect me, but it protected the wrong person. Coraline heard the answer. She turned slightly toward Imani, and for the first time, gave her a small, deliberate nod. It nearly broke Imani. David Yamamoto stepped beside her. I will take your statement myself. We will protect you from retaliation. Imani exhaled a soft, bitter laugh. Respectfully, sir. Retaliation already happens. It just usually does not have paperwork. David paused. Then he nodded. Then we will start with paperwork. The sentence landed quietly, but it mattered. The problem had finally moved beyond one morning, one seat, one insult. It had become a door opening into all the things a company did not write down but still allowed to live. Dr. Helena Voss remained standing near row 4 until Coraline looked at her. Sit down, doctor, Coraline said gently. You are making me nervous. A few passengers gave small, careful smiles, not laughter. Relief. The kind that comes after a room has been holding its breath too long. Helena sat. Gregory Hollister leaned forward, his voice lower than it had been all morning. Mrs. Bishop. Coraline turned her head just enough. I won't trouble you again. I only wanted to say I meant what I said. I was wrong. Coraline looked at him. Wrong is a beginning, Mr. Hollister. Different is the work. Gregory nodded, and for once he did not try to fill the silence afterward with the sound of his own importance. The boarding door was finally prepared for closure. A ground agent stepped aboard with the dispatch paperwork, exchanged a few quiet words with Captain Aguilar, and stepped back into the jet bridge. Adrienne and David exited first. Julian remained. He stood in the front of the cabin and looked over every passenger, every crew member, every phone still held uncertainly in laps and hands. My mother asked me not to make this flight about her, he said. So I will not. This is about every passenger who has ever been asked to prove they belonged in a space they had already paid for. It is about every employee who saw something wrong and was afraid to say so. It is about every leader who chose a clean departure time over a clean conscience. No one moved. Julian's voice lowered. This company will answer for what happened here. Not with a statement written by public relations, with names, records, training, discipline, and change you can measure. Coraline looked down at her hands. She had not wanted spectacle. But she understood testimony. Sometimes the wound had to be seen before the healing could begin. Julian turned to Captain Aguilar. You have the aircraft? I do. He looked at his mother one last time. Coraline smiled faintly. Go on, son. He stepped closer and kissed her forehead. The gesture was small, but it cracked something open in the cabin. Not because he was a chief executive, because he was a son, because the woman they had reduced to a problem was loved and known and powerful long before her last name had frightened anyone. Julian left the aircraft. The boarding door closed behind him with a heavy final sound. For a few seconds, Coraline sat still. Then she opened her book to the page where the wrinkled boarding pass waited as a bookmark. Outside, the jet bridge pulled away. Inside, Flight 447 finally prepared to rise. And in seat 2A, Coraline Bishop looked out at the long gray runway, carrying not victory but something quieter and far deeper. Her place had been challenged. Now it had been witnessed. The aircraft pushed back from the gate at 8:46 in the morning, 86 minutes behind schedule. Captain Aguilar's voice came through the speaker, warm and unhurried, welcoming the passengers and apologizing for the delay without explaining it, because explanations belonged to the company now, and the company was already beginning to write them. Flight 447 climbed out of Boston under a pale, clearing sky, but the cabin did not return to normal. Normal was gone. The leather seats were the same. The crystal glasses were the same. The soft lighting still glowed across polished armrests and folded napkins, but the people inside that cabin had changed. Some sat with their hands folded tightly in their laps. Some stared out the windows. Some looked at Coraline Bishop and then quickly looked away, as if her dignity had become too bright to face. Coraline did not demand anything from them. That was her power. She sat in seat 2A with her book open and the wrinkled boarding pass tucked between the pages. The words on the page were clear now, but she read slowly. Her knees still ached. Her chest still carried the bruise of public humiliation. But she was back where she belonged, not because her son was the chief executive, not because a powerful man had stepped in, because the seat had always been hers. Imani Carter moved through first class with quiet focus. Her hands no longer shook. When she reached Coraline's row, she placed a glass of water on the side table, then paused. "Mrs. Bishop," she said softly, "I will give my full statement when we land." Coraline looked up. Imani's face carried fear, but it was not the old fear. This fear had a backbone now. "Good," Coraline said. "Tell the truth plainly. It usually knows where to go." Imani nodded once and continued down the aisle. Across the cabin, Gregory Hollister sat silent for most of the flight. His mimosa had gone warm. He had not touched it again. Every so often he opened his mouth as if preparing to speak, then closed it. For the first time in many years, his money could not rescue him from himself. Dr. Helena Voss watched him from behind her reading glasses. She recognized that look. It was not redemption. Not yet. It was the beginning of discomfort, and sometimes discomfort was the first honest room a soul ever stepped into. When the plane landed at SeaTac, no one rushed to stand. The seatbelt sign chimed off, but the cabin remained still for a breath longer than usual. Coraline gathered her handbag and her book. She touched the small pewter compass on her lapel and rose carefully. As she stepped into the aisle, Dr. Voss stood. Then another passenger stood. Then another. Not applause. Not theater. Just space. A narrow aisle opening with the respect that should have been there from the beginning. Coraline walked off the aircraft at her own pace. Imani stood by the door. Her eyes were wet again, but her shoulders were square. "Have a safe day, Mrs. Bishop," she said. Coraline stopped beside her. "Make it a brave one, Ms. Carter." Those words stayed with Imani long after the aircraft emptied. 3 weeks later, North Star Atlantic Airlines released an internal report that did not hide behind soft language. Brittany Vaughn had violated passenger dignity standards, falsified a seat record, and exercised discriminatory judgment under the cover of cabin authority. Her employment was terminated for cause. Captain Marcus Reinhardt was removed from active command pending leadership review and mandatory retraining. The regional managers who had buried the earlier complaints were reassigned while the company opened a wider investigation into premium cabin service practices across every domestic hub. But Julian Bishop did not stop at punishment. Punishment was not culture. Culture was what people did before the cameras turned on. So North Star created a new company-wide standard. Coraline refused to let Julian put her name on it. She said no person should need a famous name or a powerful son to be treated with basic respect, so they called it the True North Standard, after the compass on her lapel. Every employee took it. Flight crews, gate agents, supervisors, executives, and Julian himself. The training did not begin with policy. It began with a sentence Coraline had spoken quietly in a conference room when the first draft had sounded too corporate. People know when they are being measured instead of welcomed. That line became the first slide. Months later, Imani Carter became one of the trainers. She stood in front of new hires and told the story without protecting herself from it. She told them how silence feels safe, only to the person staying silent. She told them how fear can become complicity when it sits too long. She told them that a uniform should never make a person smaller. Dr. Helena Voss began volunteering one Saturday a month at a free clinic in Roxbury. She said almost nothing about why. Gregory Hollister never wrote a public apology. But 6 months after Flight 447, the Hollister Foundation quietly funded 120 travel scholarships for first-generation college students. The grant required no essay, no income verification, and no photograph. Just a destination and a dream. And Coraline Bishop kept flying, always in the seat she had paid for, always with a book in her lap, always with the small pewter compass pinned to her cardigan. She never called herself powerful. She did not need to. Power was not the badge, not the title, not the cabin curtain. Power was the old woman who stood straight after being humiliated and still refused to let cruelty make her cruel. That morning on Flight 447 did not become famous because a chief executive's mother was mistreated. It mattered because too many people recognized the silence of the passenger who looked away, the silence of the worker afraid to speak, the silence of the leader who trusted authority more than truth, and the quiet courage it takes to break that silence before someone is forced to suffer alone. If this story moved you, like this video, subscribe for more powerful stories about dignity, justice, and courage, and comment these 3 words. Dignity changes everything.